Let it go, make my body go, make our bodies higher and higher.
If you're using an Excel formula and it gives you an answer that you'd rather not have, you can turn to a feature called Goal Seek. In fact, we're on a sheet called Goal Seek in the workbook 13 Data Analysis. There's a formula in cell J4. It's using the function called PMT. It calculates the monthly payback on a loan. In the scenario here, we're looking at a rate of 3.5%, payoff over 60 months, or borrowing $24,000. What will we pay each month? The payment function takes the rate divided by 12, the term in months, and then the principal. If you want to see the answer as a positive number, put a minus in front of it, otherwise it'll appear as a negative. $437. If we borrow $24,000, pay it off over 5 years, that's 60 months, interest rate 3.5%. Let's say we've been thinking about this for a while, and all along we were planning on spending $500 a month. We want this number to be $500. How can we change it? Well, we can change the rate, the term, the principal. But what do we really have control over? Probably not so much the rate. We could shop around at different savings and loans. Credit unions perhaps come up with a different rate. We do have some control over the term, and we could certainly borrow more to make this be $500. But rather than guessing and going back and forth here, let's just cut to the chase and say, let's make this be $500. We do it with a feature called Goal Seek. It's on the Data tab in the ribbon, under the category, What If Analysis. Goal Seek. Find the right input for the value you want. We'd like to change this cell, J4, to be the value 500. Now, of course, you could imagine another situation that says, I want this to be only 400. But we have to decide which of the three portions of the formula we want to change. And we can only point to one of them. Let's say it's the principal. That means it's going to allow us to borrow more money. Click OK. Excel comes up with an answer immediately. We can now borrow $27,485. And if we keep the rate and the term the same, that's what it's going to be. If we want to keep this, we'll click OK. If not, we'll cancel it. We could try it a different way by varying the term. Maybe we don't need to borrow anymore, but we do want to shorten the term. What if analysis? Goal Seek. Set this value to be 500 by changing which cell, this time the term. Click OK. We have an answer. That probably isn't exact, but for now it's just fine. If you look in the formula bar, it says 51.786. Close enough. So, different approaches here. Here's another way to use it. You're taking a course somewhere, they're giving number grades. 100 is best, 90 and above is an A. You've got 88 here. This is averaging the scores, including the empty cell for the test you haven't taken yet. The average function, by the way, does consider all entries here and divides by the number of cells where there are values. So right now it is accurate. It's adding up these cells and dividing by 6. You haven't taken your final test yet. What do you need to get on that test for this to be a 90 or above? Well, you can start guessing here. That wouldn't take too long. But let's try Goal Seek. Active cell is there. What if analysis? Goal Seek. Set this cell to the value 90 by changing which cell. The test we haven't yet taken in cell J13 right there. Click OK. And for some reason that seems to take a bit of time, doesn't it? There we are. In order to get a 90 average, we need to get 102 in the final test. Well, that's not going to work so well. What if we go back again, cancel this? How about make this be 89.5? Maybe that will work. Back to what if analysis, Goal Seek, set this cell to the value 89.5 by changing which cell? Same one, J13. Click OK. Once again, it seems to take some time. Well, maybe we can pull this off. If we get 99 on our test, looks like we'll get an 89.5, slightly higher average. That'll work. We'll get our A. Good enough. Let's keep it. Now, more business-like opportunity to use this. We've calculated some new salaries over here in column C. Everybody gets a 2.71% increase. What's the total of the new salaries? We can click column C and look in the status bar at the bottom of the screen, and there's that sum, 61 million. But let's put it on the worksheet right here as an actual function. We can type equal sum or possibly just use the auto sum button. It's found on the Formulas tab as well as the Home tab. I'm going to click Auto Sum here, and then simply click Column C. There's nothing in Column C except those numbers and the text on top. So there's the total. You're the Chief Financial Officer of this organization, and based on sales and projections, you've determined we can afford to spend more on the new salaries. Why not just make this $62 million? Well, we could start guessing by changing this percent. Every formula here in column C is based on the salaries in column B, as well as that entry in E1. In other words, the percent of increase. This one does, they all do. So, let's use goal seek to make this number be 62 million by changing this value here. And we don't want to be guessing. Let's just, as we said before, cut to the chase, go to the data tab, what if analysis, goal seek. We want this cell here to be equal to the value 62 million. 62,000,000 by changing which cell. Click here, click in cell E1. Okay, we're done. Notice how much faster that was. It had to deal with about 700 rows of data compared with what we were doing over here in column J. Not sure quite why that is, but we've got an answer here, and we can keep it by clicking OK. All the salaries in column C have been readjusted. Our formula, remember, in cell E3 is tabulating the total of column C. Click OK, we're done. Now, it's not quite perfect. As I click cell E1, look in the formula bar, or as I double-click right here, you can see what's going on. Not quite exact. Now, in a real-life situation, maybe you'll just say, well, why don't we make this 4.18, 4.19 maybe. Let's just try 4.18. That's going to be close enough. We want to have a number available that's reasonable to work with. If we keep this at 4.18, not quite perfect, but let's say close enough. Not quite 62 million, but it's only off by what, 2,861, something like that. Anyway, we've got our answer here, and we adjusted all of our entries in column C to get to a total that's just about what we want it to be, using the feature called Goal Seek, found in What If Analysis on the Data tab. In the previous movie, which you might have seen, called Goal Seek, we were able to change the result of a formula by changing one of the formula's components. In other words, one of the cells that contributes to that formula. A more sophisticated version of Goal Seek is called Solver, and ultimately it's very sophisticated. We've got a worksheet here, and there's a total here, and the total is based on what's happening in a lot of different cells. Let's imagine that we want a different total here. We're the optimistic sort maybe, and we're envisioning that this first quarter profit really should be, or could be, $265,000. The feature called Solver will allow us to come up with a new total based on not just one cell changing, but maybe many cells. If you were to review this worksheet, you would see there are formulas in column C, February entries here, that are based on entries in column B. And the column D entries are based on entries in column C. So ultimately, the data that we see here is based on what's happening in column B. These two numbers are significant, as are these three down here. So, if we want to get a different total here, we can have the Solver feature actually allow these numbers to change. We can also do it in such a way that they can only change within certain limits. So it sounds somewhat complex, and ultimately it is. In order to use Solver, go to the Data tab, and it will appear off to the right if you have it installed. It's what we call an add-in, and in order to get to add-ins, you go to the File tab in the ribbon, down to Options, and then choose Add-ins. And in this list, and it may vary in appearance, you will see eventually Solver add-in. And then down below, Manage Excel Add-ins, click Go. Now you only need to do this once, and it doesn't take very long typically. Click Go, you'll see a list here. There's the Solver add-in, click OK. Now if the Data tab is active, as it is in the background there, you're about to see this appear in the upper right. I'll click OK, it'll take a few seconds, and there it is, Solver. Large dialog box here. We are about to set this total here. Now, I've repeated this total also in cell A2. A2 is simply picking up the data from E14, so we can use either one. I'm using E14 here, that's good enough. We want to set that cell to a max, a minimum, or a value of, and I'm going to put in 265,000. We want that new total to be 265,000. By changing variable cells, I'm going to click in here. Let's say we're going to change these two cells right here. That's B5 and B6. Our sales revenue, our shipping revenue, comma, and also the cost of goods. Now I could do the other two, freight and miscellaneous, but I don't want this to take too long. Here are the cells that we're going to change, but subject to these constraints. In other words, we're going to add some constraints. The first constraint is that cell B5, and we can click on the panel where we see cell reference, then click cell B5. We can allow this to grow, but keep it less than or equal to. We've got some other options out here, but make this be less than or equal to 139,000. Let's say that we've analyzed sales and other factors in the market, and we've recognized that possibly, based on what we're assuming, that the sales figure here, this projection of 137,000, could be larger. But we do want to be realistic about it. It can get bigger, but not that much bigger. So we put a cap on it of 139,000. Let's add another constraint. Let's go to the shipping revenue. Let's say, again, optimistically, this could be larger, but no more than 28,000. So I'll put a constraint out there, a cap of 28,000. And let's add another constraint. And earlier we had also included the cell B10. This is cost of goods. And once again, taking the optimistic approach, we're saying, we hope this drops, but this time we'll change the arrow to be greater than or equal to. Let's say that we can allow this to drop, but certainly not below 75,000. So the amount that's going to be used here must be 75,000 or more. Okay, we've got our constraints in place. So here's what we're saying. We want this total, the 258,760, right now it is, we want that to grow to 265,000. Subject to the constraints of cell B5 growing, but no more than 139,000, B6 growing, but no more than 28,000, and B10 shrinking, but certainly at 75,000 or above. Let's click Solve. Solver found a solution, and we see our numbers in the background, 265,000. By the way, I've tried this any number of different times, and sometimes we get a message, Solver could not find a solution, and the answer in the background might be something like in this example, but it might be 264,997. I think in those cases you'd say, well, close enough. We can keep the solver solution, we can save the scenario. Let's return to the solver parameters dialog box and also click OK. Now, the original number over in cell B5 was 136,000 and something. I could have copied those ahead of time, but these numbers have changed. We don't necessarily know how. We could have analyzed that if we wished. We could click OK here. We're back to here. Now, where I can't claim any kind of expertise is under Options. This is ultimately a sophisticated mathematical modeling tool. If you click Options, you'll see a dialog box with GRG nonlinear. I'm not sure what that means. You'll see evolutionary. There are all kinds of other features to potentially explore. So ultimately, this is, as I said, a sophisticated mathematical modeling tool. And if you do want more information on this, as I close this here, off to the right I've depicted a web address you might want to go to, www.solver.com. Solver is a classic add-in purchased by Microsoft many years ago, and that will give you more information on how this feature works. But I think you saw in the example here the potential of this. And I believe ultimately you can have something like 32 different cells that could be changing here that you can feed into this total that you might want. You will not see Solver here on the Data tab until you install it, as we did earlier. But I think you can see the potential. A great feature, very sophisticated. In this worksheet called Scenario, in Workbook 13-Data Analysis, we've got some budget projections. All the numbers, although it's not obvious at first, are really based on what's happening in January. Formulas in February, March, April, May, and all the other months ultimately are based on the January numbers. Now, if we'd like to show alternate budget projections, we could easily make a copy of this worksheet, make 3 or 4 copies, and on each worksheet, labeled differently, we'd have a different set of numbers. And nothing wrong with that. But Scenario Manager, a feature found on the Data tab in the ribbon, it's under What If Analysis, allows us to essentially store all of these kinds of projections in the same worksheet. It begins with the idea that we might want to hold on to the projections we've already done. Maybe we'll call this our standard projection. So, What If Analysis, Scenario Manager. No scenarios have been defined. Let's add a scenario that simply defines the current one. We'll give it a name, something like standard or normal. And we're not going to be changing any cells here, but we will for the other scenarios, so we have to provide some cells to refer to, and it could be quite a few of them. I'm going to highlight cells B5 and B6. Now remember, I said other monthly entries are based on the January entries. We're also going to, with a comma first, select this cell down here, and simply click OK. We're not going to be changing these cells, so we'll simply click OK. We are defining what the standard scenario is. Now, we might have in mind 4 or 5 different variations. I'm only going to show 2. Let's imagine we want to show some other projections where the sales are lower. And in this worksheet, cell A2 contains our so-called bottom line number. It's the same number that we would see if I close the Scenario Manager here momentarily, scrolling rightward and going to the lower right corner of this worksheet. There's the number. That's our profit based on this scenario. It's also displayed in the upper left corner so we can see it more easily. Let's go back to Scenario Manager under What If Analysis. Let's now define a low sales scenario. We could call it low or low sales, something like that. So we're going to add a new scenario. I'll just call it low. Click OK. It's going to prompt me to change these other cells. Under the low scenario, instead of sales in January being 1.6 million, maybe they're going to be just 1.5 million. And the shipping income, instead of being 320,000, maybe is only going to be 275,000. The cost of goods, 918,000, maybe that's going to go up, maybe to 1 million. We could call this the pessimistic scenario. But we called it low. We click OK. We've defined that, but we're not seeing it. Now remember, the current projection shows, or the standard projection, is showing 5,127,000. Let's show the low scenario. Come on, negative on it. We might want to reconsider that, so we could come back here, choose low right now, and edit this scenario. So, in our low scenario here, we click OK, we go back here, and we've got to reconsider some of these numbers. Perhaps it's the sales number. It looks like I put in here 15,000. That's really low. I meant to put in 1.5 million. There we are. Now let's take a look at this. Come back here and show this. So, the low scenario, 1.6 million. Go back to standard, show that. 5.1 million. Quite a difference. Let's add another one. We'll call this high. Click OK. It's going to ask us to change the same cells. The high scenario, instead of 1.64 million in sales, is going to be, let's say, 1.8 million. So that's 1,800,000. The shipping income, instead of 320,000, which it is under the standard scenario, is going to be 400,000. And the cost of goods, instead of being 918,000, we're going to drop this to be 850,000. So instead of 5.1 million, roughly, for the projection, which is standard, we're now defining the high scenario, but we haven't shown it yet, so let's click show. Instead of 5 million, we're up to 9 million. So we can come back here at any time and show these other scenarios just by clicking show. And all the numbers on the worksheet that are relevant are changing. So at the moment, we're showing one or the other. Now, that means we've got to come back to this dialog box each time, though. Nothing really wrong with that, but that might get a little cumbersome. Maybe we'll have 5 or 6 different kinds of projections. Now, we're not using different sheets, so we've got the advantage here of sticking on the same worksheet as we view these different scenarios. But there's another feature that can make this even easier to read. I'm going to right-click on the Quick Access toolbar. It's above the ribbon menu. Right-click and customize the Quick Access toolbar. And under Popular Commands, we're not going to find the feature we need, but if we click the drop arrow here and choose Commands Not in the Ribbon, We've got quite a few choices here. Scroll down into the letter S. We will see an option, eventually in here, called Scenario. It's got an arrow to the right of it. Click it, and then add this to the Quick Access toolbar. Click OK. It doesn't take up a lot of space, but drop arrow, let's look at the low projection. Or click it again, let's look at the high projection. And that's handy. Jump back and forth. Now, the button takes up a little bit of space, and it's going to be there all the time unless you remove it, so there's a slight downside to that. But anytime we come to a worksheet like this, or any worksheet that has scenarios, we can click this, and depending upon which worksheet it is that has different scenarios, we can make the choice we want. And you can imagine having more than just 3 projections here too. So we have these at our fingertips, and we can easily click back and forth as we watch the numbers change. And you can imagine how powerful this might be for certain kinds of presentations. Scenario Manager, one of the tools found in What If Analysis on the Data tab. If you're in the market for buying a house or a car, you might be considering different kinds of interest rates and considering different amounts of money to borrow. And you might like to have a lot of answers at the same time. On this worksheet called Data Table, or in the workbook 13-Data Analysis, I've got some numbers down column B, and the gap between them is fairly large. If you were shopping for a house, I think you'd probably have a narrower range than this. But nevertheless, we can change this, but for the moment, I'm putting this in here for reference purposes. These are all 25,000 apart. They don't have to be equally spaced, by the way, but that's commonly done and makes it easier to read. And off to the right are different kinds of interest rates. Now, depending on when you're watching this, some of these numbers might seem a little bit off. But here, too, there's a bigger range than most of us would encounter. It goes from 3%, and then as I move the scroll bar across the bottom, all the way up to 4.5%. You may or may not be familiar with a function called PMT, meaning payment. It allows us to calculate the monthly payment for borrowing money at a certain rate for a certain period of time. So let's imagine this has to do with a house. And momentarily here, using the slider bar in the lower right-hand corner, I'll zoom in a bit. And up top, a little bit to the left. I'm going to write a so-called master formula right here. Equal PMT. For the moment, I'll make the column wider too. Ultimately, it doesn't need to be this wide. The PMT function, rather straightforward, requires first that we put in an interest rate. And for the moment, I'll simply use this cell up here that says 3%. Later, we will refer to this as an input cell. We need to divide that by 12. That's the way the function works, unless we were making a yearly payment, which is highly unlikely. Comma, and then we put in the term in months. 360 is certainly typical and common. If not, maybe 180 or some other number like that, meaning number of months throughout the term of the loan, comma, and then the amount we're borrowing. If you've never used this function before, you would be choosing B2. And it's not wrong to do that, but if you were to press enter right now, you'd have the answer as a negative. It is money leaving you every month, so to speak. So I'll put a minus in front of it so that our result is a positive number, and press enter. So if you are borrowing $200,000 at 3% interest per year, and it's 360 months, this is your monthly payment, principal and interest included. Now, zooming back again, using that zoom slider bar in the lower right-hand corner, I'll drag that back a little bit. I'd like to have that same formula be used in this entire area over here. And I could write a formula. It would involve using lots of absolute references and mixed references along the way. Might be a little bit tricky. However, if we have this formula in the upper right-hand corner of this area and start highlighting across and down, and I'll go all the way across here to the end. It doesn't have to be this big, and the spacing we can adjust later in terms of the gap between those numbers. So this is all highlighted here. We're going to go to the Data tab, and under What If Analysis, one of our choices, Data Table. See the results of multiple inputs at the same time. That's what we want. In the Data Table, it's asking us for a row input cell. In other words, which item here occurs in rows over and over and over again is the amount of money we're borrowing. And in our formula, we use cell B2, so the row input cell is B2. The column input cell, the column headings we see across row 3, represent the percent, and in our formula that we wrote in B3, it referred to cell B1. So we can click in here, type it, or click on it. Click OK. We've got answers. They're not formatted. Quick one would be on the Home tab. Click the comma button. If you want to see dollar signs, although it's going to be crowded, that's an option too. Maybe comma's a little bit better there. Do we need to see the pennies? Well, at certain points we might, but let's say for now, no. We can bring them back later. By the way, when we're doing this, we are not changing the result. We're simply not showing the pennies. In Excel, we'll do visual rounding, so this 541.67 will appear as a 542 if we decrease decimals twice. There we are. So we've got a list here. All the different amounts we would pay if we borrowed 200,000 across this row, 275, and so on. And we can begin to compare and see the differences between these. And by the way, on the percents here, I mistakenly highlighted this. Let's go back here. We want these to be displayed as percent. And here too, it's going to be much better and much more accurate, of course, to show. Well, this isn't changing the results, but we want to show the decimals behind the scenes. And probably go to 3 decimal places. There we go. Even though in some cases, maybe not as necessary. So we see what's going on here. Now, if you truly were in the market for a house and maybe it's in the $300,000 range, you might want to make this be $300,000 and then make these vary by $5,000. We can do something like that pretty easily. So $300,000. Then right below this, I'll make it be $305. And then highlight both of those. And then drag downward. And perhaps that's a more reasonable list. And we see all the adjustments immediately. And again, thinking of the percentages too. Would the percentages be any tighter than this? Or maybe you know in your environment they're all within a certain range. So we've got flexibility as to how wide and how deep this is. But we don't have to worry about formulas or anything. If you happen to click it here, you'll see something a little unusual. It says table B2, B1. You don't want to be clicking in here and typing anything. Just set up a master formula the way we did here. Consider how many breakpoints you want here. They don't have to be in order either, although logically I think you would do it that way. Same thing down here too. And these could be top down rather than bottom up as we're doing it here too. So we can have the order of these change. And they don't have to be equally spaced, although there too, as I said earlier, that's probably the logical thing to do. So we're using a data table, once again, available on the Data tab under What If Analysis.